Okay, so keeping on with our little tour of the Netherlandish Republic, the Batavian Republic, depending on what period it is, we're going to look at some delightful scenes. It varies from a peasant world to a more refined bourgeois interior. But this is a genre that was already, we could have a glimpse in the early, oh, I have forgotten to, let me see, I have to mute my crowd down there.
Sorry.
Okay. We will see how in the old, what we used to call the primitive paintings, but which is the 15th century painting, we already have a glimpse of that regular life. And in this wonderful painting by Roger van der Weyden, and this is dated 1440, we can see an actual regular interior. So he sets his scene of the Annunciation in a setting that is very normal. Let me get there. Yeah. So, for example, one detail that is really interesting is you see the fireplace is blocked by the settees that is there because winter is over. This is March. They don't do fireplace. They still dress warmly, but they put a panel, as you can see, a wooden panel in front of the fireplace to prevent the cold air to come through the chimney. And so this would be the setting for spring and summer and beginning of the fall. Typically, the bed was in the main room, in a average location, because you wanted to have the fireplace helping you in the winter to be warm enough, and you had the drapes that would be drawn to prevent the draft. Again, everything we did, they didn't have central heating, so it wasn't very comfortable, but you would draw the curtains there. So you can see everything here is represented as it would have been in the 15th century in a nice accommodation. Let's say. This is not a farm. This is a bourgeois setting. Yes.
Is there something written on the chimney? No.
No, it's a little sconce. It's a little sconce, so you would have a candle there on top. And it's one that has a hinge, so you can turn it accordingly.
Thank you.
Of course, with Bruegel in the 16th century, we have that wonderful view of the peasant world. And there are lots of debates, because these paintings didn't end up in farms, obviously, but when these paintings were painted, they would end up in typically well-to-do bourgeois homes or in palaces and so on. And this is in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which means it used to belong to the governor of the Low Countries. And Bruegel gives us that wonderful view of the hard-working peasant that rejoices during feast. And Belgian people are known, and you can find that in literature, they were known to enjoy life, which means they were hard workers, but when they had a feast day, which would definitely at that time correspond to the religious feast, they would really go out for it. You know, they would drink and dance and everything else. And so you can see there is a little image of the Virgin there. It shows that it's probably a feast dedicated to the Virgin, and they have the musician. They have even little kids that dance together here at the front, and all the others. Now, was it satirical? It's difficult to say, because they already had at that time a pretty good idea of the necessity and the use of peasants that were working so hard. They're not shown as heroic, but they're not mocked either in this place. It was kind of a realistic view. So just a quick timeline where we see the various, and I'm sorry I didn't make it crisper, but we have here that whole generation compared to Rembrandt, because it's nice to see Rembrandt as it is. We have Adrian Bauer, who, as you can see, died at 33, so very young. We'll see a wonderful painter. And then Adriaan van der Stade, these two are really peasant painters. And then much more refined, Gabriel Metsu, Peter de Hoog, Gerhard ter Boch, Frans van Meer is the elder. Much funnier, though he has his moment of refined painting, is Jan Steen, who is of the whole group, the only Catholic one that remained Catholic. And then we have Karel Fabricius that we mentioned before, and Johannes Vermeer that we will see next time. They are part of the Delft group. Sorry, because it doesn't move on.
And
yes,
where
the image wasn't moving. I'm doing it now.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
So here's the Brogan, the timeline. And then the early paintings of genre. Paintings of everyday life has also another name. It's genre painting, from the French word genre, which means just exactly that. It's domestic life, these different aspects of domestic life. So David Winkbons is one of the leaders at the time of transition from the Mannerist style, the end of the Renaissance, to the Baroque. And what he describes there is a kermesse. It's one of these big events where people, again, would dance, they had music, they had food, drinks, and typically would take place a few times a year, where the whole society there was really enjoying and then abusing too. So often you have a moralizing side to it, where you see people drinking too much, as we will see, and being sick and so on. And that really has that big warning sign, don't do that. But people were laughing just looking at it. Esaias van der Velde is mostly a landscape painter, but produced also a number of genre painting. This is a much more refined setting. As you can see, it's in a backyard. The ladies wear beautiful clothing. As you can see, the ruff has now been replaced by these high collars that were launched by Mary de Medici. So there's a big harbor, and the food is also refined. They have their crystals. It's nothing peasant in that scene. These were typically called the Merry Company. Another painter, Willem Buitenweg, he's also part of that transition group. He didn't paint very much. He had other occupation, though he is a very high quality painter, but he produced about 15 paintings in his entire life. He worked with Frans Hals at the time, but doesn't have the same bold brushwork that Frans Hals had. It's a much more refined brushwork, and it's also a more refined company when you look at their costumes and so on. This is quite expensive type of setting, lots of ribbons, which men delight to have on their calves, so showing up their legs, which the ladies couldn't show. And you can see, how they have access. This guy really has had it. And then often you have little scenes, you have dogs, and sometimes dogs take part of the whole rejoicement. Anthony Palamedes' son was a Flemish painter, but that had to leave Antwerp because of the persecution of Philip II. And he is specialist in these refined genre scene. So you can see the gentleman, this must be in a tavern setting, but you have the lady with beautiful clothing there, and the gentleman too. You have some soldiers and others. They did lots of portraits and genre painting too. He did also this one. As you can see, very refined, real appreciation of the texture, which we will see with the whole in particular, Enterbach. When you see these scenes with the lute, where they play the lute, this is typically, it has a sexual connotation. It means there's something happening there. And that's the signal, if you want, when you see that instrument. But just beautiful setting, very nice interior. You can see that the bed is there. It's part of the main room. And then you have little dog eating his bone there on the side, and a lovely still life on the table with a little monkey. Monkeys were known pets at the time. So he definitely has a cello. And they're discussing about the music too. This is a time of war, and we have to remember that. And so some painters are going to specialize, and the Palamedesson is one who will do it, show some of the tavern scene with soldiers. These soldiers were not really at war. They were there to guard the border and to guard the city's wall. And so they were idle, if you want, but should be ready to get into action in case it was necessary. And so we have these scenes where they are there and enjoying part of their idle life for the moment. And Palamedes was a very nice draftsman. So here you can see some of the sketches he did. Now, part of that generation that is no more the transition, but is really the 17th century, almost mid-17th century, is the first one is Adrian Bauer. He was born in Oudenaarde in Belgium, now Belgium, went to the north and worked with Frans Hals in Haarlem, returned to the Netherlands in 1931, was arrested actually in coming back because they thought he was a spy. You don't forget Belgium, what is now Belgium and what is now the Netherlands were at war between them. And so it was difficult to cross the border. You had to have special letters of authorization and so on, and he probably didn't. So after being imprisoned, he was released and stayed in Antwerp, where he died in 1938. Shows mostly subjects drawn from common life, peasant, smoking, drinking, brawling in taverns, quack surgeons operating on grimacing patients. And we will see how his subjects are really pretty rough, but his style of painting was extraordinary. And Rubens, the great Antwerpenaar, the great Belgian painter, loved his work because of the quality of the painting and owned many of his works. So with him, we see that peasant and low life scene. And this, he really goes at it. You can see one is really drinking, and they laid him down on that bench so that they could literally pour beer or wine in his mouth. And you have some people there that are throwing up. You have just a whole array of characters, but beautifully painted. He has also the very interesting tonal use of his colors. So this probably was part of a series of vices and would be gluttony, or gula in Latin. So people like these series of paintings. Again, imagine that in a bourgeois home, it would fill the wall. You would have 5 or 7, in the case of the vases, probably 7 of them, all represented in a very funny way, and people would have fun at it, but also it was a moralizing painting telling you what not to do. This is another scene, and I think we barely have to describe. You can see yourself what's happening. This is what happens when you drink too much. And so people would take the moral side to it, but they would at the same time laugh at what the people were doing. Sometimes the animals, as I said, would take part of the whole thing. Here, this is part of the senses. This would represent the sense of smell. And I think, again, I don't have to explain. He's torching the behind of a child there, and you can imagine the smell. There's no doubt. So this was a way of showing the smell, as well as this one would show the taste. And that's the bitter draught. And you can really appreciate on his face that he doesn't like what he's just been drinking. And then you have another one, feeling. So he's going to probably remove something, and this was done in a very primary way. No anesthetics or anything. Fighting, yeah, this happened when you drink too much or you have these things. They would show these peasants in a very summery interior. Here you can see there's no refinement whatsoever, but they're going at one another. And one is speaking from the right, from top of the stairs. This was also, when you look at the expression and the physiognomy of the people, this was derived of different manuscripts that existed about physiognomy. And so they would compare either sometimes animal profiles to the similar faces and give some of the characteristic of the animals to the individual who had that face. So you have extreme désespoir, so out extreme despair there, and the other one is color. So this would be fear, the one on the right. So many writing, Cocles goes back to the 16th century, and Indagine with romance and physiognomy. So again, you can see how they compare. And Bruegel worked a lot with these type of profiles, and you can really pinpoint on many of his paintings the kind of character. So short-necked was an indiscreet fool. Teeth out of place, man of no worth. So Americans should be really good because their teeth look so wonderful. Towards the end of his short life, and probably influenced by what was happening at that time in the Netherlands, he's going for what we call the tonal phase. And the tonal style is really the very soft use of pigments, very much all into the ochre series. And this is it's between a landscape and a genre scene where you see people outside of their miserable little houses, but beautifully described. Now, a friend of his, he also studied with Frans Hals in Haarlem, is Adriaan van Ostade, was born in Haarlem in 1610, studied with Frans Hals together with Adriaan Bauer. Also paints scenes of low peasant life, tavern brawls and dimly lit interior. But after 1640, his palette is going to lighten up. and the subjects that are still from peasant life become less ribald and grotesque. And it goes together with, again, literature that shows peasants as very important segment of society and that they should respect. And so certainly you're going to see them showing more as honorable people. He was very successful, very much imitated, and is probably one of the teachers of Jan Steen, who we will see later. So again, here we have a tavern sign. This is probably one of the best he did early in his career. But he is a little more polished than Adrian Brouwer was. The village musician, this is already later in 45, so he's reaching the peak of his career. And as you can see now, we have musical instrument, and even if it's a peasant interior, it's a much more polished interior. He was also looking at the works of Rembrandt and became quite influenced by him. The merry peasants, you have men, women, children that are seated on benches and stools in front of the farmhouse. You have a fiddler and a hurdy-gurdy player. Hurdy-gurdy was big at that time. It had that kind of nasal sound that you would turn the handle and just produce that kind of very strange sound. But this was really good for dancing also, and they drink and they smoke already. The painter's studio is an interesting painting that we use very often because for us art historians, it's an interesting way to see how they did it, the kind of support he uses. In this case, it looks like it is a board, so a panel. Look also the way the windows are that are very typical of the time. You didn't have large glass pane. It was not made at that time. So you had to work with small ones that became stained glass windows that were linked with lead. But you can see different of his tools all around him, and he was not a very orderly painter. The interest in light is also interesting. You can start seeing the effect of light projected on the scene. This is a more satirical painting showing the alchemist at work. And alchemists, we have to be very careful because the early pharmacists were alchemists. But you had the alchemist who wanted to transform the metals into gold. And that was that foolishness that he's representing here, where they could turn base metals into silver and gold. And all the way until the 18th century, some people believe that. And this is what you see where he abandons everything. He's going to spend all his energy and all the little that he owns to try to turn these base metals into gold, which is, of course, not possible. And on the floor, you have a little piece of paper, an inscription on the treatise, the Re Metallica by Agricola of the 16th century, that shows oleum et operam perdis, oil and work is wasted. Now, this is also a mix of genre painting, but also still life. When you see the number of different objects and tools that are there, that he represents in a very faithful fashion, showing the way the reflection of light works on a ceramic pot or some wood or other metals. He's a very high quality painter. He did a lot also of works on paper, some prints as well as drawing. And this one is a watercolor on paper. Shows a magnificent knowledge of drawing and very good perspective and composition.
And what
Yes.
sort of process would you have to preserve paper for this long?
That's luck, literally. That's okay. Now, do remember, we're not talking paper as what we have now. These are cloth paper that are far more resistant. It's only in the 19th century that paper is going to be made from the tree pulp. And the tree pulp is the big problem. It's acid and it eats itself up. So when you have your old, pocketbook, you can look at them, they turn brown. You've seen that. This is because it's done from tree pulp, and they hadn't yet at that time treated the paper to prevent the acidity. That kind of a paper is a thicker paper made of cloth. There's a whole process where they take these old cloths, they break them down, put them in acid and so on until they decompose, and then they drain it on kind of a screen and drain it and let it dry, and it ended up, they press it and it forms a sheet of paper. So paper at that time, and I've shown these papers, I have some at home. These papers are much more resistant. Don't forget that all the prints that we have from Rembrandt time are on paper. Yeah, that was the loss of when they went for much cheaper process with the tree pulp. They didn't realize it was going to turn so bad. When you have, yes, Jerry?
What did they add to the cloth to have it hold together?
Yes, I will bring you back. I have the whole process of how to make paper one day. But they use, as I say, cloth, and it could be everything, sails or whatever. And then they would just pull them apart in small pieces, and then it would be in a bath with some chemicals, and I don't know the formula. Then it would be pounded. They would have, that's why it's a water mill that was doing it. So they had the mechanized huge hammers that would pound that thing until it was just like pulp. Then they would drain it on screens. And once it was sufficiently drained, then they would gather them and press it with very heavy press. Then they would hang it with clothespins, if you want, until they were dry, and there you would have a sheet of paper. Some more of his, this is a pen and brown ink over, he produced over 400 of these, by the way. And this is an etching.
That was on the paper, or was that on the etchings were printed on?
The etchings were made, as you know, on a copper sheet.
Yes.
And then you would print it
On paper.
on paper.
On this paper they made.
Yes, yeah. All the paper, that's all you would have. The paper replaced in the 15th century, about mid-15th century, paper replaced parchment. Now, moving to more refined people, we have these wonderful artists such as Gabriel Metsu, who was born in Leiden, so the same place as where Rembrandt was born, but in 1629. Again, his family had moved from the southern Netherlands there because of the persecution of Philip II, was probably trained with Douw. And remember, Douw was a student of Rembrandt, and he was part of the Painters Guild in Leiden. He then trained in Utrecht by Knupfer and Jan Weenix, who are two other painters that do landscapes as well as still lifes. He moved to Amsterdam in 1658 and died in Amsterdam 9 years later, was buried in the Nieuwkerk. His works are rarely signed, but he mostly painted portrait and still life, but also a lot of genre scene. And they, as you will see, much more refined. He is just a lovely painting showing the sick child. this is really the kind of work. These are what we call the fijnschilders, the fine painters. These are paintings you can go very close to, you won't see a brushwork. They're extremely, the slower painter, much more meticulous in the way they were painting. And this is the new style that really put Rembrandt almost out of work, because as you know, Rembrandt had that very wild brushwork, came out of fashion. And these are the ones that replace him. So here you have that wonderful scene where the child is on her mother's laps, almost reminiscent of Christ on Mary's laps. You have a very religious interior with a cross, but also the beautiful soft light on the child. This is a self-portrait with his wife in a moralizing tavern scene, very similar to what Rembrandt did in spirit, not in form, but to what Rembrandt had done early in his career. And these are very often representing, in fact, the prodigal son, the biblical story of the prodigal son, who forces his father to give him his inheritance ahead of time, leaves the house, spends all his money with women and drinking and so on, and then suddenly has lost everything and is reduced in a Jewish family to guard pigs. And he finally decides he cannot even survive there. He goes back to his father, who welcomes him with open arms. So very often the moralizing side, and in the Netherlands, don't forget, you have very highly Calvinist society, very religious and very conscious of the good things to do in life and the bad things. And so very often you have that contrast, because they're going to have a pendant painting showing the good side and the bad side. But this is one of the ones that you see quite often. What you should not do is, you know, drinking and frequenting women that are not your wife. Though in this case, we know it is his wife, but this is not what is represented. But you can see already that refinement in the clothing, the use, it's absolutely delightful. Red, you know, dress that shows that undergarment that is, red with a black, looks like velvet on top. The very large glasses, they had these, at that time they were making glass that are huge, and where you would have the wine. This is these beautiful Dutch glasses. Here you can see how we lead very quickly to what Vermeer is going to do. And it shows you that Vermeer was not the only one. He just brought it to a certain perfection that makes it unique. But these are absolutely beautiful paintings. And this is a pair, by the way. This is a pair that you have on one hand, the gentleman with the gorgeous oriental carpet that is at that time not on the floor, but always decorates the table. And he's writing a letter in that very refined interior with beautiful windows, these small pane windows, a magnificent landscape with some figures there, but with the typical Baroque frame that existed, the expensive Baroque frame that were very elaborate at that time, and very refined garment. And then you have the other side is the girl who receives the letter that he has written and is on that upper, that little step above, and that kind of a box that is put on the floor to prevent her to touch the humid floor. Now, as I mentioned to you, this is not realistic. There were no tiles on the floor there because it's humid and cold. You would slide on this. So normally this is only done for the exercise of perspective. But typically on the floor, you would have had wooden floor with a mat. That is much more, makes much more sense in the Netherlands. And so she's up to get let's go. There's one shoe that you can see there. And then you see the servant, the maid, is opening that drape. And behind there is a ship in a kind of a storm. And so the meaning can be different, but as we know by this one, he's not a captain, he's not on a ship. So this would say that maybe their relationship is in turmoil. That's the possibility. Now, don't be surprised to have that drape. This was very often the case in houses. To prevent the painting from fading or from getting dirty, they would cover it. And from time to time, they would open the drape to see what is under there. Very much like the Chinese and the Japanese do with their paintings that are these big walls. They would choose by the season, they would pull them out and maybe hang them for a couple of weeks and then hide them again. So these were very often hidden.
And the colors in that are just wonderful.
They're wonderful. He's
Now,
a superb painter.
It had to be restored to get up to this.
There's no yellowish, so definitely this one is in Dublin, and I'm not. I mean, the pair, fortunately, is together in the same museum. Doesn't happen very often, but it looks. You're absolutely right. The whites are white, so they must have been clean. But look at the depth of that carpet. It's absolutely superb. And here, I don't want to detract from Vermeer, but I want to show you that they were superb painters that are contemporary to Vermeer. Another excellent painter is Peter de Hoogh, was born in Rotterdam and so his name can be spelled in different ways. The spelling wasn't written in stone at that time. Sometimes it would change. He was a pupil of Claes Berchem, who is a good average painter, but he would learn his technique and so on from them. He was at the service of Justus de Grange in Delft, in The Hague and Leiden. So he would be not only a painter, but probably would be of different uses for that person. He married in Delft, became a member of the guild in Delft, and then moved in Amsterdam in '67 and died a few years later over there. He's probably the closest to Vermeer, and they were contemporaries, knew one another, and it's a debate of who learned from the other. Is it Peter de Hoogh that looked at what Vermeer was doing, or is it Vermeer looking at de Hoogh? So again, there are scenes of soldiers because soldiers were around. It was part of the landscape. So here you have two soldiers and a serving woman with a trumpeter. Again, beautiful use of the color, because this is a darker place. This is a small tavern, no window, but look at the dark red who comes out beautifully from there. This was the time between 1630 and the 1640s where Frederick Hendrik was conducting campaigns against the Spanish Netherlands south, because they were actually attacked by the Spaniards. And so the soldiers had to be ready to go. A woman and two men in an arbor. So this time we are outside, and this is that transitional phase he has when he goes from tavern scene to the domestic interiors and courtyards, as we will see soon. And you can see the fashion is the same as what Vermeer shows in his paintings, very typical. And then you have a series of paintings that show people, again, totally unreal to have tiles on the floor on the outdoor. Imagine with the place where it rains almost every day, how dangerous that would be to walk on a place like that. But it really was helping them for the perspective. So what he's starting to show, because he really is going to show his own style, he includes adjoining rooms or streets. So it tries to have succession of vista, if you want, in his paintings. Very typical is this one, where he has that open door, and even there you have that little alley that ends up on the street behind, all the way at the end. And this was, of course, playing on the whole idea of perspective. He loves the play with the light, as you can see in a darker room at the front and then the sunlight at the back. He probably also, don't forget, there's a whole series of painters in Delft at the time, including Karel Fabricius, who we've already talked about, and we'll talk about him next time when we talk about Vermeer, because Fabricius died in the explosion in Delft at a very young age also, but was extremely promising and was the most talented student of Rembrandt. Now, what is interesting, when the museum that received this painting, so it's the Royal Collection in Windsor, the whole window was painted over and was replaced by a curtain. Also, there was just a landscape through the open door. So they had modified the painting. Fortunately, they were able to clean it up, because it is so typical the whole when you see it this way, but sometimes the tastes differ. And I just want you to compare with that painting by Vermeer of a lady drinking and a gentleman. And what you see there is very much the fact that Vermeer has refined even more the painting than the whole. But the spirit of the painting is very similar. And genre painting, you know, again, don't forget, we have no more, or almost no religious painting anymore. So these paintings were before just addressed to the nobility or to the church, now enters the medium-sized house, and the bourgeois society is expanding in the Netherlands. And so the need of the patrons becomes different, and genre painting are entertaining, are pretty decorative, and people really love it. So that becomes one of the genre the most appreciated. This is a lovely painting showing also the qualities of a good housewife. She keeps the house clean and educates her children. And that was the thing to do. And this has almost that religious undertone, if you want, showing it. Now, again, we have this long view towards the outside, the mother or the name, you know, coming out of that door. And interestingly enough, that panel on top here is not in its original place. This used to be at the entrance of a convent in Delft, but the convents were dismantled, and so somebody must have picked up that say there that is. That was on the Hieronymusdale cloister in Delft, and the inscription reads, I'm going to give you the translation. This is in Saint Jerome's Vale. If you wish to repair to patience and meekness, for we must first descend if we wish to be raised. And so this was the way that people that were entering the convent would read that say, and that had been relocated into that regular home. is going to reuse this in another painting of his. So shows that the building must have been very familiar to him. And he reuses that for that other scene where the girl is sharing a drink with these two gentlemen. The little girl is in the same passageway. He's going to move to Amsterdam, and there, of course, Amsterdam was the big city. Amsterdam, there was a lot of money, and so his style is going to change according to the location. So now he's going to show some richer domestic interior. Now you have the lady and the servant and so on and so on. But immediately by the architecture, you know that you are in a much richer home. You have even pilaster at the windows and at the door. So a much more refined architecture. And then the beautiful, what they call a casse, an armoire that would hold all the linens that, as you can see, the lady of the house is taking from the hands of the maid to put in the cask, because these were precious linens. And also you can see the little girl, and look at what she's playing. She's playing with a golf stick, which is the ancestor of the golf club. And golf was often used, for example, on the ice. They would send one another like a puck for the how do you call it again? Yeah. And but as you can see, children were playing with that too, and this is definitely the ancestor of the golf club. Another extraordinarily refined painter is Gerhard Terborch. And let me see, why don't we take just 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to finish that series on the image of Gerhard Terborch. So 5 minutes, and if you have questions online, please let me know. If you could put the light on your way out, just one of them is fine.
And I have a question.
Yes, I'm listening, Jan.
So like today we use canvases to paint on. What are those made out of paper?
Could you repeat?
Today we use canvases to paint.
No. These, the thing on paper that you saw are just watercolors. These are paintings on canvas.
Is canvas
The
made
one
out
we
of,
just saw. So what is an etching? Etching is on paper, or watercolors are on paper, as it is nowadays. But paintings on the other paintings are either on panel or on canvas.
and what is canvas made of?
At that time, it was linen. Cotton comes only later. Nowadays, they're mostly made of cotton. But at that time, they didn't know cotton yet, really. Pardon?
Where did they happen? They weren't in the cathedrals. They were in homes.
Oh, these were in, you've seen the interiors that you see there would have paintings in there, and they might be cheaper. You know, the better the painter, the more expensive the painting.
Right.
But they had a rich middle class in the Netherlands. Lots of merchants. All most of the middle class coming from Antwerp and so on, that had converted to Calvinism, are going to move to the Netherlands. So Antwerp lost, in 20 years, lost over 50,000 people, which was half of its population. Yeah.
So I wonder how they found them. Maybe people die and give them to the museum or something.
No, it was, in the Netherlands, it was very well organized. When somebody would die, they had an inventory made, if they had heirs, children or whatever, they would inherit whatever they wanted. And but otherwise it was auctioned off.
Oh, okay.
They had auction houses.
It's amazing.
But if you know what is interesting, when you realize how much we have now in museum and private collection, this is only 2% of what was made.
Really?
So think of 2%. The rest disappeared in fires, in regular, accidents.
We'll
Or what.
find it at Goodwill.
Oh, you find it at Goodwill, exactly.
I have a question about the.
Yes, please.
The kind of a larger subject matter of men and women together.
Yes,
Because I remember reading about chivalry and sort of a movement from the religious art that was the love towards God, more toward the love towards.
yeah, but then you
women.
go back to the 13th, 14th
Is that when the
century.
era
Yeah.
was? Okay, that was, when did that sort of troubadour?
Yeah, because
mentality
you see,
come
the
from?
chivalry was the ancestor of all that aristocracy that is there, but that ends up in the middle of the Renaissance. We're in the Baroque now. This is the 1600s.
300 years later.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so society has changed. As I said, this is middle class, particularly in the Netherlands, which is a republic. You don't have aristocracy anymore. You have very rich merchants, but you don't have aristocracy. Aristocracy stopped at the border. No, that happened started in 1585. The Netherlands became unofficially free, independent in 1609, and then officially in 1648. But it was already a republic from de facto in 1585. And it's becomes Calvinist, mostly Calvinist, though they were tolerant to other religions, as long as they didn't proselytize.
Right.
So that was the whole idea. But in the southern Netherlands, which is now Belgium, the country depends on Spain. So they have a king who is also an emperor, by the way, not anymore. Philip II is no more an emperor, only his father was. And but there you have a very structured aristocracy. And you have a growing bourgeoisie who wants to behave like the aristocrats. So it's a different atmosphere altogether.
And you said that was more endemic of the Baroque period?
That's the Baroque. The Baroque starts, around 1600.
But it sounds like the art has much more of an emphasis on the middle class. And
Especially in the
chivalry.
Netherlands, because don't forget that the Calvinists don't allow any images in the churches. Until Calvinism, how can I say, the church was responsible for over half of the paintings that were made, either for the church or for private devotion in the houses. This disappears almost entirely, except in the Utrecht region in the Republic, because Utrecht is the only province that remains Catholic in the Netherlands.
And did you say the Renaissance was that period of moving away from that?
Yeah, the chivalry, all that is now, even in the Renaissance, is talked in the literature, but is no more true. So yeah, you still have in some things, and that's going to be shown very clearly in the representation, you still have these idea of profane love and religious love, if you want, heavenly love. So that remains, but then it's always attached to some literature. You see, Titian shows that, but you have pictures that are going to go together with a matrimony, with a marriage. And so they're going to have a nice painting that shows some more suggestive things, but it's supposed to go for the healthy love between spouses. this is mostly when you see the scenes that are more relevant, and we'll see some here too. It's always a lesson behind. It shows you what not to do. And in some of the scenes, you will see some kind of high-level brothel scene where they also tell you, you know, young ladies don't fall into that trap, you know, things of the sort. So it's not, how can I say, professing the idea of prostitution. To the contrary. But they find it funny, you know, it's kind of saying, oh, we can't see that, we can't see it, but we see it. So there is some hypocrisy there. But yes, we're going to go back. Jerry's going to come back, you know. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to mute you again, guys. Okay, so another of these very refined painters is Gerhard Torborg. Was born in Zwolle from a painter turned tax collector. It tells you that painting at the time, because the church is not the patron anymore, the whole way of selling paintings changes. You have painters now that are paying some people to sell it on the street. Or they're going to have the increasing number of art dealers, as was, for example, the mother-in-law of Vermeer was an art dealer. And then you have kind of a market, regular exhibition of paintings that people can go and pick up. But sometimes it was because the church was not a patron anymore, that it was more restricted, if you want. He becomes a pupil of Peter de Molijn in Haarlem. He will visit England and will be acquainted with the portraits of Van Dyck, who was in England and was the celebrated painter in England at that time. In 1640 and 41, he visits Rome and Spain and is impressed by the works of Velázquez, and you'll see how he's inspired by him. Then he stays in Münster in 1646 to 48, where we will see will happen the big, finally, peace treaty signed in 48. He goes back to Spain in 49 and moves to Deventer and will die there about 20 years later. He's one of these very refined painters. And here in that, let me move. That lovely portrait of that little girl in that big dress, the presence, she seems so lost in that big dress, is directly inspired by the works that he had seen of Velázquez in Spain. But it's absolutely touching and adorable. And she looks so mature with that little purse on the side. It's really adorable. This is a small portrait, but must have been a commission, of course. Children were not living very old. There was an enormous amount of death, child death at that time. So people that had the means were very fond of having pictures of their children because they might be all they had of them. To show you his variety of work, he did a huge painting of the ratification of the Treaty of Munster on the 15th of May, 1648. That treaty was very important because it ended the 30-year war, but it also ended the war between the Dutch Republic and Spain and confirmed the independence once for all of the Dutch Republic. And these are, as you can see, old portraits. These are not just representing some faces, but these are all portraits of people that were present. Torborg is known for his incredible representation of fabric. After he died, in his inventory were found big yardage of these very expensive satins and taffetas, that so that he was able to drape them and be able to paint them from nature, and to show that the way the light hits the dress is absolutely extraordinary. And you can really go with your nose on the painting. It's not going to change. It's done in such a refined way. This painting is called The Fatherly Warning and was celebrated by Goethe, who saw a copy. There's 2 or 3 copies of that painting. And Goethe fell absolutely of this. But the thing that he didn't realize is that, in fact, what is the raised hand of the gentleman there, and that has been abrased on all the version of the painting, is a coin. So this is not an how they call the admonition of the father, but in fact, is a man who is buying the services of the girl with a coin. As the next owner, after the painting was painted, had removed the coin, but you can see the abrasion. It was transformed as the admonition of the father, where it's not that at all. But absolutely superb. Yes, and I'm going to show you, you can guess between the fingers, you can guess the abrasion there, that the hand that was holding the coin. Very much in the style of Vermeer. Vermeer has painted many of these type of paintings. The woman writing a letter. Again, you can see the beautiful oriental carpet there, but the light, the way the light strikes her dress, and she's very studiously writing with the quill.
I'm curious about the oriental carpet on the desk.
Always, because they were very precious and beautiful, and so this is what would cover the tables when they were not in use. But you wouldn't walk on them. And again, you see the bed behind. This one is a different, it looks like a Turkish bed. So the theme is probably, they believe that the person she writes to is her lover who is on the sea. As the Dutch had 2 huge trading companies, one going west and one going east, a lot of people were employed on these ships. Again, he's showing his talent here with a woman reading a letter. With a big contrast of the dark in the background. You can barely guess it, but you can see how much he enjoys showing the beautiful fabric of the dress and the fur around, trimming the black coat there. And the little dog on the seat. So you can see how this is a much higher level crowd, if you want. He also had paintings with very close observation of people that surrounded him. And this is just an adorable scene where the boy is reading the dog of fleas, so looking in the fur for the flea. Very much in the manner of what Chardin is going to look at him later on. He's an 18th century French painter who does a lot of these genre scenes, but in rather modest environments. And towards the end of his life, he does this wonderful painting, not even showing the face of the young musician, but again, enjoying the beautiful representation of the textures all around. He's a very creative painter. Now, part of this is actually two generations of painters. Frans van Mieris the elder, and you have Frans van Mieris the younger, who will follow the steps of his father. And sometimes it's difficult to define who is whose. He was born also in Leiden. As you can see, Leiden was a very great sources of artists. He studied with Derrida. And he died in Leiden in 81, so he lived only until his 40s. He does mostly domestic genre scene with a very highly polished technique, and the tradition will be continued by his son Jan and Willem, and by Willem's sons, Frans II. Again, here you see, if you didn't know Van Mieris, you could say this is a Vermeer. It's very much the pleasure of the beautiful interior and the young ladies, in this case, playing clavichord. And often when you have a scene like this, it's you have a young woman courted by a young man. In this case, it looks like it is the teacher, and then you have the young boy and the dog behind there, but very refined interior with a beautiful, what looks like a landscape there. And then you have a portico leading to the next room. So this is an expensive room. This is a painting by Vermeer, showing the lady standing at the virginal. As you can see, that shows that the pattern of life was very similar. This is the brothel, and indeed you have the young man who is showing his money to the younger, who is he wants the services on. Often you have these girls and you have the instrument on the wall, hanging on the wall. That is again a referral to sexual undertone in the painting. And these erotic subjects in the Calvinist Holland are really interesting. As I mentioned, it's very hypocritical when you think about it, because they tell you don't do it, but they show you the thing. Young woman in the morning, and the little dogs, as you can see, pets were everywhere. And the servant is making the bed. And this is probably one of his most wonderful. It's a tiny painting. It was at the exhibition. It's a painting on copper. It was at the exhibition in the copper is canvas. Yes, I should have brought, I have the poster, which is the size, almost the size of this. The painting itself, and I don't have the measurement here, but it's really small. It's about this size. So about 20 inches by 12. It's incredible. It represents the allegory of painting. As you can see, the young woman has the palette and the brushes in her hand. And she's holding a mask and a statuette in her arm. What is incredible is the fabric that you see there. This is called a changeant. This is a French term, but it's used in English for a special weave. So the way you weave the taffetas, you weave it with two different colors. And so when you move, the taffeta is going to get one color, and when you move it another way, it's going to get another color. And that's what you see here, for example. This would be red and blue, and depending on how you move the fabric, it's going to show one or the other color. This is incredibly difficult to render in painting, and this is what he shows, is the changeant. That's absolutely superb. It's such an adorable painting. And of course, the idea of doing it on copper copper being such a tight surface, allows him to paint in a much more faithful way than he would do on a canvas, by the way. The lace maker, again, you can see the Oriental on the table, and beautiful clothing too. And she's making lace, which was one of the handiwork for a young woman at the time. And this is on wood, by the way. An interesting subject, just like Derrida, he uses that window to see the young boy blowing bubbles. This had comes from the Latin expression homo bulla. Man is like a bubble, which means be careful, it bursts easily. Which means about, again, talks about the fragility of life. And this was done also by Chardin in one of his paintings a century later, the Homo Bulla. Now, a very different painter, but that can go from incredibly refined to really interesting, is Jan Steen. He was also born in Leiden from a brewer, and he's the only Catholic of the bunch, and he's going to remain Catholic. They didn't have to hide as long as they didn't proselytize. He was probably trained with Adriaan van Oostade in Haarlem and Jan van Goyen, who is more of a landscape artist in The Hague. He worked in Leiden, The Hague, Delft, and Haarlem. He opened a tavern in Leiden in 1972, and it seemed to be very adequate for his character. He was a jolly fellow, a jolly good fellow, we'll see. You can see in his portrait, self-portrait there, where he's playing the lute, and you can see his kind of a bubbly personality. He was very prolific, wonderful colorist, versatile, inventive, painted portraits, including children, historical, mythological, religious subject, and still life, and widely imitated. This name was so known that it became, and you will see, understand better when I show you the paintings, the Jan Steen household. It's become an epithet for an untidy house, because it's joy before tidiness, which was against the Calvinist beliefs of the time, we have to understand. Early on, he shows some more formal paintings, such as the Burger of Delft and his daughter, where he's sitting in the front of his house on a nice seat, and a beggar woman comes by with a child. Again, the idea that you had to help the poor people was very much part of the belief. But it is first and foremost, it's a portrait. As you can see, extremely talented, but he's got a completely different flavor in paintings as what we see with the others. This is an interesting painting for so many reasons. It shows the doctor's visit. And what does it show? It's a young woman who is almost fainting in her seat. Now, what we see is telling us a lot, and we can understand the subject. You have a painting on the wall showing Venus embracing Adonis. You have a child with a quiver and arrows. That's Cupid. You have a dog. It's a hunting dog with hunters. And you have the lady there that is kind of smiling at the dog, holding a urine sample. You get it?
She's pregnant.
Yes. So she's pregnant, and that's why the doctor is there. She's having problems. So that's also the critique and kind of a satire of the doctor, who feels extremely important in his role there. For those of you that have been at the Mauritshuis in the Hague, this is one of their little treasures. The oyster, the girl salting oysters. It's also a small painting, about the same size as the Vermeers that we saw before. And again, the oysters are laden with carnal overtones. When you see painting somebody eating an oyster, because of the way you eat it, is very sensual. And so this is, again, one of these things with sensual overtones. Also, according to the ancient mythographers, Aphrodite, known to the Romans as Venus, was conceived in an oyster shell, which subsequently transported her to the island of Cyprus. So to the ancient and early modern mind, Aphrodite symbolized love, sex, and fertility. And so this is linked to oysters. It's a beautiful little painting. Again, you have a still life here at the forefront, and the very, I mean, particular way of the girl of looking at you says everything, I think. Another scene, the morning toilet. The girl is in the state of undress, so she's provocatively pulling on her stockings and looking directly and invitingly at the spectator. So again, you have an erotic character painting there, no doubt. But it's beautifully rendered, the color, the blue color of the drapes, the bed and the columns. It shows a very refined painter. And of course, as I mentioned to you before, you have the lute there that is directly linked to that erotic undertone. This one is very known, and this is pretty much to do with what we talked about, the Jan Steen household. That's the idea. This is a mess. And that's when you say that's a Jan Steen household, this is what you see. In this painting, we actually have the 5 senses. We have 3 generations in the center of people. You have the grandparents, you have the parents, and you have the children. You have in the center a clay pipe, which is linked to the smell. You have the violin, which is the hearing. You have the dog and the monkey. As you can see, the donkey is pocket picking. It has to do with touch. The food and wine, of course, taste. And the fire and the picture, sight. You also have playing cards and oysters, which represent vices. So very rich in symbolism in this painting. These would be conversation pieces. So you would hang that, and you typically would be probably the dining room, where you would have people sitting around the table, and you could talk about this and talk about such author that mentioned this and mentioned that. This was the conversation. It was the television of the day. Another of these painting, it's really cute, is the Feast of St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas is not known as much in the States, except in the north. But St. Nicholas is that saint that became the patron saint of children, because in his story, he saved some children that had been kidnapped by a butcher and who was going to put them in salt and sell them as meat. And he saved these children, and since then became the patron saint of children. It has remained, I told you my mom was going to call me. Anyway, on the 6th of December every year, St. Nicholas comes, and so that's before Christmas. And in Belgium and in the Netherlands, the children put the day before, put their shoes at the fireplace, put some, typically some fruits, apples and mandarins, and then some sugar for the donkey, because St. Nicholas comes with a donkey, and a glass of water for the donkey too. And the day after, when the kids wake up, they have biscuits and marzipan and speculoos and so on, and gifts. the kids get more gifts at St. Nicholas than they do at Christmas in the northern part of Europe. And so this would be the face of St. Nicholas, as you can see, typical with the hat and the big beard. And in Amsterdam, he comes from the sea on the ship, and this huge feast for the kids. You go and see the arrival of St. Nicholas.
It is a song.
Yeah. And he is a statue of St. Nicholas. He was a celebrated saint. So again, it's just a wonderful discussion. You can see that the little girl received a doll and she's very happy, but he is not happy with whatever he received. Or maybe he was a bad boy and he didn't receive anything. But it's really a family scene in the house. And then some more formal scenes where he shows here a garden party. And this would have been a commission where he was asked to paint the family within that setting. So a wonderful artist, but much more ironic in feel, if you want. Nothing is straight with Jan Steen, but they're just a great artist. And so this is really that introduction to the genre paintings. And next time we will see Vermeer of Delft, but introduced by Karel Fabricius, who, as I mentioned, lost his life during the explosion in that killed thousands of people at the time. But was a very promising artist. So hope to see you then. If you have any question, let me just finish this one and stop the recording.